Welcome to the Atheists of Florida YouTube channel. We are pleased to offer some of the most significant speakers and profound issues of our times. If you like today's video, please hit the like button. If you have already subscribed, thank you. If not, you know what to do.
Great. Thanks so much, Judy. I'll get my slides started. And yeah, hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to see you all here. So I'm, if any of you don't know where Waterloo is in Ontario, it's about an hour west of Toronto, maybe 2 hours north of Buffalo if you don't have a bad day at the border trying to get through. My specialty, like Judy was saying, hang on, I just gotta get started here. I like to study religion and non-religion through its numbers, and particularly its impact on society and society's impact on religion and secularity. So that's kind of my main area. So get ready. There are statistics, but I will present them hopefully in a fun and approachable way to give you a sense of kind of what's going on, what a few topics I've been working on that I thought might interest you. And then once I'm done talking, obviously the Q&A, we can go in any direction that you're interested in. I've put up my details here. I'll add the slides once I'm done talking. I'll add the PDF slides into the chat so that you can have all these links, because I got a few resources here if anyone's interested. Judy mentioned the book that came out in 2020 with Joel. So that's a fun read if you're kind of interested in looking at kind of where non-religion is at currently in the States of Canada. It's one of many books that have come out in the last few years on this topic, because it's a growing topic that more people like Ryan Cragen and myself and Joel are working on. I'm also a research collaborator in that non-religion in a complex future project that's headed by Laurie Beeman here in Canada, but it is an international team, and there's an American cohort contingent, and Ryan is on that project as well. And so that's kind of like a multi-million-dollar research project, kind of looking at, where is religion at, non-religion at now, right? Like, what does it look like in a society where it's been growing for a certain number of decades now, including in the US? What does it look like? What's there if religion isn't there amongst individuals? So that's the big project. And there's a website, so there's lots of great free resources. So if you kind of like what I'm presenting today, there's lots of other colleagues of mine on that project who have similar works or kind of works on different topics on non-religion. So it's worth going and checking out. There's also free webinars and events tied to that project. So every so often we'll get together on Zoom and have a chat with a recent author or a collaborator. And then finally, I'm also going to head the Non-Religion Secularity Research Network soon. So I'm president-elect, and that's basically like a large group of academics. We're kind of loosely tied together through digital networks. And Ryan is also involved. Ryan Cragen's also involved in that. There's also a website there, also more great events and resources if you're interested in non-religion and kind of studied from a more social sciencey academic approach, if you will. So go check those out. The last two are free. The book is relatively cheap. It's like, I think about $30 US. But the other two websites, there's lots of free resources there if you're interested. And from there, you can find lots of links to social media and YouTube channels that are related to the projects. So today, again, as Judy mentioned, most of the material I'm taking for the next half hour, 45 minutes, I'm going to talk about is coming from a new forthcoming book that is meant to be out in August. We'll see if that's actually happens or not. I have yet to actually see the edited proofs of this book. The manuscript has been submitted, but the proofs are supposedly coming. So it might be delayed a bit. I don't know. These days, you never really know, but it should be out hopefully at the end of this summer. And it's all about millennials and non-religion, right? Especially, even though also looking at kind of the religion and spirituality side as well of that generation, both in the States and in Canada. That's kind of my thing. I often compare both countries. And so if you want the link to the book there, again, I'll add these slides to the chat afterwards. It's there. And so you can go, if you're really interested, you can pre-order yourself a copy. But a lot of what I was going to talk about today is from that book. Okay, So like I said before, if you need me to repeat anything, you have a clarifying question, don't hesitate to kind of just jump in. We'll keep any kind of questions during the talk. Please just keep them like brief if they're just, you need a clarification of some kind. And then we'll have lots of time at the end for proper question and answers, for like substantive questions to go in the directions that you guys are interested in, right? Because with new groups, I'm never really sure what your key interests are, what everyone wants to hear about. So I'll kind of throw a little bit of everything at you. That's my plan, and hopefully something will be interesting there, and we can pursue it further in the Q&A. So I thought I'd start us off, just got a brief context or reminder of where the non-belief in God is at in the US and Canada. Now, these are potentially numbers that you've seen before. I'm not really familiar with how much you've seen of this, but this is data from the American General Social Survey, so it covers the whole of the US. This is a good quality survey that's run every couple of years now by a research team in the US. It used to be done in person, but they pivoted to online in 2021 due to the pandemic. But this is, here in this slide, we're looking at the rate of belief in God as self-declared by respondents in this survey. That's a pretty representative sample of the US population. And so we can see here that trend is on the downward, is going down. There's less people now in the US that we estimate that say they believe in God. And here I'm taking a very kind of broad definition of a belief in God or a higher power. Respondents who say they believe in God or a higher power at least some of the time to a certain extent. There's kind of like different options in the survey about how certain you are. And anyway, so any kind of hint of a belief in God, they get classified in this percentage. And so you can see here that it's gone down recently. We're at kind of 84% of the adult population in the US says they believe in God or a higher power. Now, if we look at that by generation for more recent years, so this is data specifically from 2021, right? So the trend we saw on the last slide was from the late 80s all the way to 2021. So it's declined about 10 percentage points over that time in terms of belief in God. And here we see it. So there has been a decline across every generation, every age group during that period. So for example, members of older generations like the silent generation born between 1926 and 1945, their rates of belief are a little bit lower than they used to be, say, if you ask them, 20, 30 years ago. But we also see added to that a generational effect, whereas the younger generations, millennial generation, has a lower rate of belief in God or a higher power, right? You see that on the right, they're at 78%, so lower than amongst their boomer parents and grandparents, for example. Now, just a quick note here, there's a lot of debate about who falls into the millennial generation. I know that, say, Pew Research Center will use an earlier block of birth years than I do. So they'll say that anyone born in the 80s and 90s is considered a millennial. I tend to kind of like to go in kind of 20-year blocks for my generations when I work with them with social data. And so I tend to define the millennials a little bit younger than that. So born from about the mid 80s to the mid 2000s. But depending on the definition you find, there's no set definition here. There's demographers kind of debate this amongst themselves. You might consider that people born in the early 2000s could be like the transitional Gen Z people, who are the kind of older members of Gen Z, but I still count them as millennials. So just if you're curious, if you're wondering, slight variations on definition, but overall we're talking about roughly young adults to about the early middle-aged adult category at the moment. So yeah, so they have lower rates of belief in God as well. Something you've probably already heard, right? These rates of belief in God have been declining, especially amongst younger people in across the Western world and including in the US. I thought, okay, this is like the scary number table. There's a lot of numbers here, but this is to compare the US, where US is at compared to a series of different countries. So this data now is from a different survey, the World Values Survey. That's a big cross-national survey. We basically ask a bunch of the same questions in a large number of countries every 5 years. So in this case, there's 79 countries in the most recent wave that was done between 2017 and 2020. And you can see here the US where it ranks relative to a whole series of other countries. Like I said, I'll give you guys the slides. So if there's other countries you're particularly interested, you're welcome to look at it in more detail later on. But here we get a pretty similar rate of belief in God in this survey amongst the US adult population as well, in the late, around the 2017, 2020 bit. So this question was like a straight, do you believe in God? Yes, no. And so 82% of the US respondents said yes, they believe in God. In other words, there's just over 15% who don't believe in God, right? And that puts the US kind of in the middle, a bit at the kind of lower end of the middle pack here out of the 79 countries, right? So it's not the most believing, it's not the least believing, it's kind of just in the lower range of the middle there. Canada is even lower here. If you're curious, this is where I'm at, where you see about 59% of respondents say they believe in God, which ranks Canada quite a bit lower in terms of proportions of people, of believers in the country. So just to kind of give you a sense of where the US is at. Okay, so let's, the focus here, I want to spend a little bit more time on a topic that I'm working on a lot these days, and that's caught my attention, and that's in the forthcoming book, is looking at these non-religious millennials, who they are, what they do, new things that they're encountering now that non-religious people in previous generations have not necessarily encountered. So new dynamics in the generation, and how that relates to, you know, coexisting with religious, spiritual millennials, other members of their generation. So I thought I'd start us off with kind of giving you a sense of, you know, the data that I'm using for this project, and a bit of like who these non-religious millennials are, how I define non-religious, and what they look like demographically. So the book is mainly based on a survey that I ran myself in 2019. So it's a pre-pandemic survey, so worth keeping in mind when we look at these data. I called it the Millennial Trend Survey, and I went and surveyed about just over 2,500 respondents, but young adult respondents, so between the ages of 18 and 35 years old, both in Canada and the US. So I got a grant here in Canada to do that. You know, I was interested in a variety of topics, but mainly on kind of indicators of religious, spiritual, and non-religious behavior, identity, and practices. So I'll call it the MTS for short. That's the acronym I'm referring to here. I administered the MTS online between the 4th and the 27th of March in 2019 in both English and French, right? Because we have a large French-speaking population here in Canada. The survey questionnaire contained about 69 questions on the respondents' sociodemographics, their non-religious and non-spiritual affiliations, beliefs, practices, as well as their friendship networks and their attitudes towards other groups and certain policies. Yeah, so it was about a 15-minute survey, and I had, like I said, just over 2,500 respondents fill it out. Now, it's worth mentioning a bit here the quality of the data, right? Because not every survey is the same, right? I'm sure, like, you've seen lots of surveys online. Some are better quality than others. You know, sometimes it's just someone surveying their friends. Sometimes the sample is quite problematic. It's quite specific, but they're making inferences to the whole population based on it. In my case, I recruited these 2,500 people from an online polling firm, Léger, which has over 400,000 registered members in both Canada and the US. And so that's where I kind of went and got the sample. And from within that larger pool of over 400,000 people, we selected these 2,500 a bit at random, but also looking for specific kind of demographic traits to fill strata to make sure they were pretty representative of the population. So we made sure that, you know, there was a good representation of the different age groups, of different genders, of different levels of education, of different regions across the continent. And then within that, we picked at random people within those strata. So that's kind of a decent way to make a more representative sample when you're surveying these people, because that's kind of what we want, right? We want to get a sense of, you know, we want to get a sense of what millennials look overall and make good quality estimates based on these survey data. You know, I love talking statistics, so I could talk about this all day, but I assume many of you are not that interested by the methodology side of things. So, but if you are, we can totally come back to it if you're that person. But yeah, I just wanted to say it quickly, just so you have a sense of where these data that I'm going to present in my remaining slides come from. Yeah, so we compared this sample and its characteristics to other samples we get of young adults from like kind of other big surveys, so like the General Social Survey, census data, and it seems to be pretty representative of the young adult population. So I was pretty happy with that. So one of the types of analyses, so once you gather this survey data, you need to crunch it, right? You need to like, make it, there's a lot of data that you get, you want to kind of analyze it and kind of get key findings from it. So one of the analyses I did with these data is called the latent class analysis, which is a fancy name for a type of statistical model. Basically what latent class analysis does, it'll look at how respondents answered a series of survey questions. And from this information, it extracts a number of underlying groups that kind of groups people together according to their patterns of answers to survey questions, right? So in other words, it's a type of statistical analysis that identifies patterns in respondents' answers to survey questions and groups them accordingly into different underlying categories or latent classes, right, of individuals. So the survey questions that I looked at, I want to see how respondents were kind of answering a whole series of survey questions, which is usually a better way of just relying on just one survey question to give you a sense of what's going on. You want like a whole battery of them to see how people are answering them in kind of patterns and in different ways. So I've got the list here up on the slide. So we're talking here about survey questions like someone's affiliation to religious group or not, their belief worldview system, so belief in God and higher power, a mysterious universe, or a more kind of material worldview that's kind of more based on science. The frequency of their more kind of like less conventional spiritual activities that aren't necessarily tied to religious groups. So things like yoga, meditation, mindfulness, anything that was defined as spiritual by respondents. So like taking a walk in nature, for some people, they would self-define that as spiritual. The frequency of prayer, of religious service attendance, reading religious or spiritual materials, making offerings to their ancestors, and a digital religious and spiritual content, consuming it, making it, as well as non-religious content, celebrating rites of passage within a religious or faith group or not, as well as discussing religion and spirituality with friends. I want to get a sense of, okay, depending on how people answered all of these questions, what are some of the kind of big underlying groups of millennials that we can find in their approach to religion, spirituality, and non-religion? So from that analysis, I got 4 groups, 4 latent classes that seem to be like the optimal model for these data. And so, I'll go through quickly all 4 of them with you and give you an example of each one, but we're going to focus more on the non-religious group for this talk today. So we found kind of more religious millennials, spiritual seeker millennials, what I call cultural believer millennials, and non-religious millennials. So let's go through each one and just give you a sense of what we find across the generation when it comes to how these respondents answered these questions and how they kind of group together in these 4 categories. So the religious millennial, these were young adult respondents who were the ones who were more likely to fall into this category than any of the other 3 are kind of probably what you're thinking in your brain. the first impression you have of this is probably what you actually find, right? So these are individuals who, for the most part, believe in God according to the teachings of their religions. Without exception, these respondents also score very high on all forms of religious behaviors contained in the analysis. So attend religious services quite frequently, pray quite frequently, consume religious materials digitally and on paper quite frequently. And these can be like more personal behaviors they just do on their own or with a group as well as digital behaviors. And there's also amongst this religious group about 25% who take part in the kind of less conventional spiritual activities as well, right? So are also defining other activities in their lives as spiritual, right? On top of a more kind of traditional religious practice that you find among many of these individuals. Now, these individuals are coming from many different religious traditions, right? It's not just Christianity. They're coming from Islam, from Judaism, especially in this sample, but also a series of other minority religions as well. And so this is your kind of quite actively religious portion of the millennial generation. So I put an example up here of Kamal. Now on top of doing the survey, I'm also involved in a number of research projects, some of which do focus groups and interviews more in depth with individuals. And so this is where these quotes are coming from, is especially a project out west in the Pacific Northwest, in BC, as well as Washington and Oregon, that we've done over the last few years, where colleagues of mine conducted focus groups and kind of got feedback from all different types of millennials. And Kamal, which is a pseudonym, we don't use real names in research, we give them pseudonyms. Kamal is an example of a more religious millennial who took part in one of those focus groups. So Kamal, born in 1989, was part of the focus group that we did in Vancouver, British Columbia back in 2018. And Kamal kind of personifies this religious millennial category when he says, I think growing up post 9/11, there's a lot of media attention on what it is to be Muslim. And I think it became a strong part of my identity because of that. I go to the mosque on the Friday, pray in congregation. When Ramadan comes around, I don't want to be breaking fast by myself in my apartment. I want to be with people who have also been fasting. So Kamal, of the Islamic faith, quite active in his religiosity, quite practicing. Then we have the second group, which is what I call the spiritual seeker millennial. And so the way the stats analysis works is it just gives me the groups and I have to give the group a title, right? So this is my name. And this is, I felt I gave these people the name that kind of best represented the category that they were in. So this second group is characterized also by a high level of religious identity and affiliation, although not quite as high as amongst the religious millennials. And not quite as high as amongst the cultural believers that we'll see in a moment. But they tend to believe in God in their own way, not necessarily strictly tied to the teachings of the religions, but more on a kind of more personal level. That seems to be how they define their belief in God. This group also has kind of mid-levels of religious and spiritual behavior. So the kind of religious behaviors I named for the religious millennials in the last slide, these spiritual seekers have a lot of the same behaviors, but just not quite as much of it, right? They don't do it quite as often. So they might attend religious services once in a while, maybe a few times a year, but maybe not like every week or every month. And so that's kind of like middle, they're not completely non-religious, but they're kind of in the middle when it comes to the religious activity. But what they do have more than any other group is those kind of less conventional spiritual activities, as well as kind of self-identities more tied to, being spiritual as a person. And so, there's a lot of these less conventional spiritual activities that were named in the survey by respondents. And so I've got the example of Stephanie here, who's from a Washington focus group from 2018. And Stephanie, again, kind of personifies the spiritual seeker millennial. Not all of them are hippies, but they're kind of, some of them are borrowing, a lot of them are borrowing from some of those new age 1960s countercultural movement trends and kind of making it their own in current day. So I'll read this. It's a bit of a long quote, but it's worth reading. I quite like Stephanie's quote here. Stephanie says, I tend to get a hippie label in my group of friends. You'll see why in a moment, because she is kind of very hippie-ish, and she laughs about it. So if I start spouting off something about, Mother Universe and us all going back to the same dust that we came from and being part of one big energy that we can't really explain, I've considered Buddhism, I guess, especially, or just meditation practice. I guess things like convening with nature and being in nature and playing music to me are my everyday spiritual practices. And I find meditation and activity and being with other people in my own way. I haven't felt compelled to seek some other kind of structured community that's specific to a religious creed. It's like I was raised by two people from very different cultures from this region, and I've never really felt like I had a culture that I inherited. For me, it was very much that I built my own culture, beliefs, philosophy from the ground up. That, like, obviously all of our parents influenced us, but I feel like my culture comes very much from myself. And there's definitely a strong vein of getting back to authentic culture that stems from people's actual needs and feelings and behaviors. So these kind of some themes coming through here, right? Kind of, obviously the more spirituality themes, as well as this kind of notion of personal authenticity, which is a common theme that you find amongst many millennials, especially amongst these spiritual seeker millennials, trying to get back to like the real authentic self. That's very much a trend that we see across our societies, but that we find especially amongst younger demographics. We can talk about like how much those authentic experiences are actually authentic or actually just kind of shared by a lot of people and are part of our social structures these days, but that's often how people want to define themselves and how they tend to talk about their identities and practices, especially amongst this group. And then third group, we have what I call the cultural believer millennial. So this group is characterized still by very high rates of people who identify with a religion, as well as pretty high rates of belief in God, but often, again, in their more kind of personal way rather than specifically tied to a religious or a religion or a religious tradition. But these individuals have very low levels of religious practice, right? So these people very rarely go to a church, synagogue, or mosque, maybe like once or twice a year for a special occasion or for a holiday. So here we see like individuals that are, again, see the religious identity as quite important. Maybe see beliefs, like vague beliefs still tied to that identity is quite important to them, but who don't see the activity as going along with that, right? So don't do a whole lot tied to religion in terms of their everyday practices and lives. So you might have seen references to similar groups before in other things you've read. I'm not sure how much you've read on this topic, but they're called a number of things in our kind of research world. Sometimes we call these individual marginal affiliates, fuzzy affiliates, nominal affiliates, or cultural religious affiliates, right? So again, for these individuals, their link between the religious affiliation and some of their beliefs, they link that especially to their family, their regional, and or their cultural heritage and values. And for them, that link is still quite important enough that they don't let it go, even though they're not actually practicing a religion all that much. And then finally, okay, no, wait, I forgot. I was going to, use Andrew as an example here for a cultural believer. So Andrew, born in 1988, identifies as Jewish and took part in a focus group in Seattle, Washington in 2018, personifies many of these dimensions of the cultural believer millennial. So Andrew says, I used to pray. I don't anymore outside rare occasions in community space. Then it's communal driven, that's for sure. I think I take part in ritual spaces, but as a shared cultural experience, which I think is often bolstered by a certain nostalgia or continued tradition or whatever the thing is that makes us do things when we wouldn't otherwise, because it's what we grew up with, because we share that familiarity within a space, right? So Andrew won't attend synagogue all that often, but he'll go occasionally because it's a more community-based activity for him. And then finally, we get to the group that is particularly interesting to us today, perhaps, is the non-religious millennial, who basically scores low on all religiosity and spirituality indicators. So on all the survey questions asking them about religious identity, beliefs, and practices, it's like for most of these individuals, it's a hard no. They're not all that interested in a lot of it. Some of them are maybe a little bit interested in spiritual activities, but anything to do with organized religion, it's a hard no. They lots of those behaviors I mentioned, attending religious services, praying, that most of these respondents do little or none of that at all in their lives, right? When I ask them about their worldview, it's often a common one is more a material or scientific worldview, right? They kind of explain the world around them through kind of physics, biology, kind of material processes or scientific processes, much more than in a belief in God or some kind of mysterious energy or power or universe. You also find amongst this group a large portion who are not really certain about what they think of the world, right? That kind of maybe more agnostic worldview, if you want, who don't really know much about, they've never really thought much about what they believe or don't believe and don't really care that much about it, are quite indifferent to that. You'll also find that group here amongst the non-religious millennials. So Kelly is an example of someone who grew up with non-religion and who's never thought a whole lot about it, right? So Kelly's born in 1992. She was interviewed by a colleague of mine out in BC, Lynn Marks, who's a historian of non-religion, in 2018. And when she's asked about how she defined herself in relation to religion, she kind of doesn't have much of an answer. Lynn actually had to prompt her a few times to be like, because Kelly's like, I don't know. I was like, well, have you thought about it at all? And finally, Kelly answers, well, I don't know. I wouldn't describe myself as anything really. I don't really know. I haven't been exposed to different religions while growing up. So I don't really know what I define myself as. I just really wasn't exposed to it. I've never taken the time to learn about it enough for me to create an opinion or educate myself on it. It hasn't been something that I've found to be necessary for me to live comfortably here in the city. So I forget which city. Oh, wait. Oh, well, this interview was done over the phone. She's in one of the Pacific Northwest cities, probably Seattle. It hasn't been something that I've found to be necessary for me to live comfortably here in the city or to even like find friends or anything like that. And we've kind of, as a family, kind of concluded that if there was some greater power or some God, then things that are so horrible wouldn't be happening to people, right? So she kind of shows it at the end that she doesn't necessarily believe in God, even though she hasn't really thought a whole lot about it. Sarah, not me, but another member who took part in a focus group, is another example of a non-religious millennial, but maybe one that has kind of stronger views on religion or more specifically on Christianity and has had more experience with Christianity, but like more negative experience with Christianity for the most part. So Sarah, born in 1986, was part of a focus group that we did in Portland in 2018 and takes more of maybe like an anti-religious stance when she talks about her dislike of Christianity. All right, so Sarah says, for me, religion had always been about the symbolism, and then going to church had been about family and about community. And so when I went away and went to college, I lost that connection to that family. So there was no real reason for me to go to church because all the ritual is fine and some of the songs are really comforting because that's part of my childhood. But for me, the whole and the teaching of Christianity, there's just not much there for me. It doesn't serve my needs, and there's too much I find really repulsive and really antagonistic towards queer people like me and towards women, and just unsuitable to living a life in this world where we need to get along with each other and where we need to really respect our relationships with other creatures and other beings, whether or not they're sentient. And so I've always erred more towards science and looking for ways to show that empathy is more important than religion, or empathy is more important than winning. That if we want to survive, we should be looking out for the best for everyone. So even though I'm not religious, I have very strong convictions about morality and justice and the common humanity among people. All right, so Sarah starts out with a critique of Christianity, but kind of then transitions into what her beliefs or how she approaches the world, how she sees the world, and what she values as an individual, near to the end of that quote. This slide here, figure 3, is the size of each of these 4 groups in both Canada and the US, right? So 4 key groups. The spiritual seeker millennials and cultural believer millennials are the 2 smaller groups, right? They're definitely there. They definitely represent a substantial portion of millennials. So you can see in Canada, spiritual seekers are about the same rate that you'd find in the US, around 22%, so about a fifth of millennials. The cultural believer is more of a Canadian thing, specifically, especially in the more kind of central or eastern parts of Canada that still have kind of strong regional and family heritage ties to different Christian traditions. In Quebec, it's Catholicism. In Atlantic Canada, it's a few different Protestant traditions. In Ontario, it's a mix of both. And so it's actually quite common in Canada. You find quite a lot of people who identify with a Christian tradition, but don't do anything about it, or very rarely, if ever, attend a religious service. And so, it's slowly declining. That cultural believer group is getting smaller amongst millennials. It was especially a thing amongst boomers and Gen X in Canada, but you still do find it amongst millennials as well, and more so in Canada than the US. The US, you've only got about 12% millennials who fall into that group. The 2 larger groups are the ones on each side here, right? So you have the religious millennials, who represent about a quarter of Canadian millennials and 40% of US millennials, right? If that's according to that grouping that I got from the analyses. And then on the right-hand side here, you have the non-religious millennials who represent a bit more in Canada, right? 36%, so just over a third of the Canadian millennials, according to estimates from my survey, and just around a quarter of US millennials, right? So, non-religious millennials haven't taken over as the main group in the US, but they're kind of headed towards that, right? The non-religious group amongst millennials is much larger than it used to be amongst Gen X, boomers, and the silent generation, even in the US, where, US religiosity indicators only started declining more recently, especially since the 1990s, whereas in Canada, they started declining around the 1960s, as well as in other Western countries. But even in the US, where decline started happening a bit later, you do find a larger non-religious millennial group than amongst older generations. So, it's not the main group yet amongst millennials in the US. That religious millennial is still pretty dominant, but it's getting there. It's slowly moving in that direction. So it'll be fun to see with Gen Z, the next generation, what we get. If we see a continuation of that trend, a larger non-religious group, or if the trend changes with a new generation. We'll have to see. That's always the fun of studying different generations. There's always more to come if you want. So here I just wanted to kind of point out to some of the demographic differences that are kind of specific to non-religious millennials that you find between non-religious millennials and everyone else, so religious, spiritual seekers, cultural believer millennials. Interestingly, I think the most surprising finding for me here when I was looking at these numbers was the fact that there's not that much demographic difference between them. Actually, there's a lot of diversity, with a caveat, a lot of diversity in terms of levels of education, of rural urban residents, of genders, of household income levels amongst the non-religious population, amongst millennials. Now, I'm not going to show the data here. At some point, I have to stop with the statistics, but amongst older generations, it was quite common, say amongst the silent generation, boomers, to find that your non-religious population, it was there, it was smaller, but it was present amongst those generations, but it tended to be dominated by white, male, university educated people. Not always, but just as a trend, that group was especially dominant, was especially present to a greater degree amongst the non-religious in older generations. But we no longer see that, with one exception, amongst the non-religious millennials. Now you see a pretty even rate of men and women. You see a pretty similar rate of university education between the non-religious and the rest of millennials in the US. And this is data from the US, right? It is very good. And, it's not like it's all just rural people who are religious anymore amongst millennials. There's about an even split. In fact, because a lot of the religious populations are being fed by immigration, you actually do find it, especially in more urban centers now, which is like a shift, because in the past, in older generations, you'd find more religious demographics in rural areas. But yeah, the non-religion seems to be more widespread among many social groups, especially amongst millennials, right? It's no longer just like one type of individual that takes up most of that space in non-religion. There is one big difference that is still out there, though. That's the one exception that I was talking about. That is that non-religious millennials are still much more white than the rest of millennials, right? So it's only 17% of non-religious millennials who, in the survey self-identified from a non-white ethnic background or race, versus 40% amongst, religious, cultural believers and spiritual seeker millennials. So there's not as much ethnic and racial diversity amongst non-religious millennials. That's still something that hasn't developed as much amongst the demographic. We'll see in future generations what it looks like. And that 17% that is amongst non-religious millennials, a large chunk of that is East Asian ethnic background as well. So people coming from China, Japan, they also make up a big share of the non-religious population. So there's much lower rates of, say, Hispanics or Black individuals within this non-religious cohort. So that's something we might want to talk about a bit more, why that is, why we see it. The theories that we're kind of working on, and from a more sociological perspective, right? We're always thinking of social environmental factors that might be at play. Is that, some of these individuals, BIPOC individuals, individuals coming from Black communities, from Hispanic communities, face a lot more social pressure when they want to leave their religion than, say, a lot of kind of white people amongst millennials in Canada and the US. And so, people who are kind of like in between, you'll get your hardcore non-religious people who leave anyways and just deal with those social consequences and penalties in their family and their friends. But the kind of group that's in the middle, that's kind of like, well, they probably identify as non-religious in a more favorable environment where non-religion is more normal or normalized and more socially accepted. Those individuals are probably not identifying as non-religious when they're faced with strong penalties from their community. And so they're still taking part in religion. So that's kind of we as sociologists, we tend to look for kind of environmental factors related to social interaction that might affect these rates. Okay. So to kind of, summarize so far, I'm kind of quickly looking at the time here. I won't go on forever, I promise. But, just to kind of give you a sense of, sometimes I present these statistics and people say like, well, why are we seeing this, Sarah? Why are we seeing a decline in rates of belief in God? Why are we seeing a rise of non-religion amongst a younger generation? The theories that I work with a lot are kind of more contemporary theories of secularization in my field of sociology of religion. We call them theories of secular transition. And these are theories that really put the emphasis on one key variable, especially being, how much are children exposed to religion and non-religion growing up. That often affects how they are as adults. Not always, but as a trend, everyone has their own agency, and some people are different as adults than they were as kids. But for the most part, a religious adult was quite actively religious as a child with their parents as well. Right. And so when you find yourself in a time and a place where there's less of that religious socialization, like millennials find themselves now in the US and Canada, people don't pick up religion as much, right? So for us, religion is a social phenomenon, right? So if you're in a context where, you have to go to school and you learn about a lot of faith and a lot of religion there at school, you learn it in your family kind of takes you to religious service quite often, well, then you're likely to pick it up as a child. You don't always, but often. Whereas at the opposite end, in a context where there's a lot less of that or none of that, right? Your family's not necessarily into religion. You don't really see it at school. Going to religious service is kind of weird and abnormal and doesn't happen in your everyday life. It's quite rare for an individual to then pick that up later on in life. So that individual is likely to stay non-religious throughout their lifetime. Again, there's some variations there, but as a trend, that's often what we see. And that's the variable that we see as kind of key in kind of transmitting religion, or in this case, not transmitting religion. And so this kind of secular transition away from religion is happening across generations, right? So this is not something that happens overnight. This happens as, parents raise their children in different social contexts, in more secular, less religious social contexts. You often see a large growth in that non-religious population. And that's often what you've seen, not amongst all millennials, but amongst many millennials in Canada and the US. That's like a quick, elevator pitch of, there's obviously a lot more complexity here, but of kind of how we see the decline of religion happening. It's often we tie it to these kind of changing social and environmental factors and kind of moving everyone away from non-religion, but especially amongst younger generations who haven't grown up with religion at all, kind of stay non-religious as a larger group later on in adult life. Okay, so just kind of, again, cognizant of the time here, I want to make sure we've got lots of time for Q&A. So I'll only go to maybe I'll talk for another 5-10 minutes here. There's some kind of really interesting socio-political differences between the religious and non-religious millennials that we've seen in previous generations that we still see today. Here is one way of illustrating that, right? Basically, to summarize what I'm about to say is that, your non-religious millennial is probably one of your most left-leaning, politically progressive groups in America today. It is quite left-leaning or, more liberal values on a lot of socio-political issues, including, being pro-choice for abortion, being pro-immigration, pro-feminism and pro-women's equality, being, much more in favor of spending and protections for nature and the environment, much more pro-LGBTQ plus issues as well, and not being so much caring so much about the economy and the health of the economy. And that's what this graph is basically showing. So what I did in the survey was I gave respondents a whole bunch of different words, and I just said, like, quickly, give me your, do you feel positive about this word, negative about this word, or you kind of don't care, like, do you not care about this word? This is one of many ways to measure kind of people's political values or value orientation in surveys. I always kind of like this one because I kind of feel it's like off the fly, and it gives people's sentiments towards how they're feeling about words related to the issue. And so, and so then what I did once I got everyone's answers is I kind of gave scores based on, the proportion of people who gave a more positive value to the word, the proportion of people who gave a more negative value to the word, and didn't give any points for the proportion of people who were pretty neutral towards the word. So I'll give an example here. Just give me a sec. I'll just find it in my notes here. So for the word homosexuality, for example, there was 31% of religious millennials who gave a negative association for the word homosexuality. So with that 31%, I gave it a negative score of -31. 60% of religious millennials did not select homosexuality for either positive or negative associations. So that got 0. I didn't give any points for that. And then 9% of religious millennials had pretty positive associations with the word homosexuality. So they got a score of +9. So adding that all together, that's what gives the score of -22 for the word homosexuality for the religious group of millennials, for example. And so here in the graph, you can see that for pretty much, all the words I was talking about, right? Abortion, immigrants, feminism, nature and the environment, homosexuality, the non-religious had the most positive associations, or the largest proportion of the non-religious millennials had more positive associations. So score pretty high, at least compared to the other groups. So the spiritual seekers, cultural believers, and religious millennials. So it's kind of indicating a more kind of, left-leaning value orientation. And you see the flip side of that when we ask them about the economy, they tend to score the economy lower than most other groups, right? So you've probably heard this before, right? I'm not necessarily revealing anything new here. Millennials overall as a generation tend to be more left-leaning and progressive in their values. Right, they are one of the voting bases more for the Democrats in the US, as well as here in Canada, more left-leaning parties like the Liberals and the NDP. And so that does extend to religious millennials. Religious millennials are more progressive than their older religious counterparts from like boomers and Gen X, but there is still a religiosity effect, being that the religious millennial is still more conservative on average than the non-religious millennial who's more progressive, right? So there's like a shift left amongst the millennial generation, but the non-religious are still more left than the religious are. So that's why I was trying to illustrate here with this slide. So it's something we can come back to, right? But that's still a big difference that we see in this generation. There's still a big religiosity effect in people's socio-political attitudes. And then what I want to kind of wrap up on or end on was maybe the idea that, even though in the US, non-religious millennials are not yet the largest group amongst the generation, it is slowly does seem to be becoming people's default option that they kind of default onto, that doesn't require a whole lot of thought. And that is maybe what they often find in their environment, more so than older generations. So there's kind of two series of findings here that I feel kind of point me in that direction. So here in this table, this looks at, the percentage in the C column here. So second column from the right. This column is the percentage of my young adult respondents who fall into different kind of religious groups or traditions, including those who are Catholic, mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, other religions grouped together, as well as those who say they have no religion. So you see the rates here amongst my respondents in this C column here for the US. And then I compare it to what their parents were, because I also asked them, what religion or faith did your parents identify with? And so we can see, for example, in the A column, so second from the left here, you get the percentage of respondents who come from like a homogenous, either Catholic, mainline Protestant, evangelical, other religion, or no religion background. So that means both parents were from the same faith or non-faith tradition, or they only had one parent, and that parent was either Catholic, mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant. And then in the B column in the middle, we see the percentage of people who had a mix of parents, right? So who had one of each, right? A Catholic, a Protestant, a non-religion. So had a mixed household, because we know that mixed households are less successful in transmitting their faith to their children. So that's why we often keep them separate. And then I compared, right? So in the D column, all the way on the right, is the gains or losses, the intergenerational gains or losses. So compared to the ratio who had, parents of a certain religious group, to what extent does the millennial respondent still identify with that group, or has changed the group? So for example, for Catholics, we see a 28% decrease in the number of millennials who identify as Catholic as compared to their family. And the way that I kind of did it was that, to be considered a gain or a loss, you have to, if it's a gain, you have to kind of get more than one, like if you're coming from a homogenous background, right, you have to change up, right? Like you have to go from not being Catholic to Catholic. And from a mixed background, you kind of like get like a 50% chance. If you're over that 50% chance, then you've kind of successfully transmitted the faith or not. So there's no gain or loss. And so we get a decline, an intergenerational decline of about 28% of millennials who identify as Catholic versus their parents, in other words. You also see that decline amongst mainline Protestants. It's pretty flat amongst evangelical Protestants. The evangelicals seem to be pretty good in at least transmitting rates of evangelical Protestantism in the US across generations. It's not because everyone who had evangelical parents is also evangelical. There is some kind of leaving evangelicalism amongst millennials, but it is compensated by conversions into evangelicalism, so that stays pretty flat. In Canada, that evangelical group is also on the decline to a certain extent, but in the US, it's pretty stable. So it's only a small gain of 2% intergenerationally. Other religions in the US have declined by about 22%, again, as a whole category. That's especially coming from like Black Protestantism, as well as I think kind of Orthodox Christianity is a big one in that larger or other religion group. In Canada, there's actually gains in that group because it's mainly an immigration group. So it's like kind of Islam, Sikhism, Hinduism is larger in Canada, and that's been gaining a lot from immigration especially. So that's kind of like a plus in Canada, but not in the States. But the big gains are coming from non-religion. So there's a lot more millennials who say they have no religion compared to what their parents said, right? Basically, there's been an increase in 102%. So a lot of millennials are switching into non-religion, right? So their parents were tied to religion, but they're disaffiliating or just weren't really into it that much since childhood and have become non-religious. Right, there's only an estimated 48% of the religiously unaffiliated, so the non-religious young adult respondents from Canada, as well as 45% from the US, that have at least one non-religious parent. So in other words, the rest, the majority, don't have a non-religious parent. They switched into non-religion at some point before they answered the survey. So that's one big source of growth, right? It seems to be like the group that's gaining is the non-religious group. So one indicator that seems to be like more popular now than it used to be, right? The other indicator is for those who do have non-religious parents, their parents seem to have been quite successful in transmitting that non-religion to their millennials. So the vast majority of millennials who have two non-religious parents, right? So that's what we're seeing here in this graph. The vast majority in the US, right? So in the yellow bars here that come from a no religion parental background where there's only parents who didn't have any religion. The vast majority, 91%, say they also have no religion themselves as millennials at the time of the survey, right? So that's like a very successful transmission rate, right? Like that means non-religious parents are only losing 9% of their kids to a religion, which is way higher. That transmission rate is so much higher than every other religion in the US, right? This is the most successful transmission is amongst non-religion in the US. And it's also way higher than what it used to be. So if you ask like members of the silent generation or boomers who had non-religious parents, if they themselves stayed non-religious as adults, many only about 20 to 30% said yes, they stayed non-religious. Many converted into a religion as young adults, often when they married someone from a religious faith or got friends from a religious faith, and because they were also in a more religious social environment back in the day. Now that's no longer the case, right? So this is, on top of a lot of millennials disaffiliating, millennials who grow up with non-religion, for the most part, keep it as young adults, right? So again, for me, that's kind of like an indicator that this has become the default, right? It's not like there's a social environment for many who are pressuring them into religion. You would see that in the numbers. You would see it with lower disaffiliation. You would see it with lower transmission of non-religion. What we find here is for many, not all, but for many, a more kind of secular social environment where they feel comfortable staying non-religious if they grew up non-religious, and switching into non-religion if their parents came from a faith background for the most part. So that's actually like something that's quite new amongst the millennial generation that we didn't see as much of before in the US. So a few key takeaways before we get to the Q&A. I promise this is like my last slide, last couple of minutes here. Right. I'm not finding, you might have heard before, like theories about, people circulating in an open religious marketplace and like, buying and consuming religion as consumers. I don't find a whole lot of evidence for that amongst the millennial generation. That's not really how I see things happening in the millennial generation. I don't see a lot of conversion happening amongst millennials. Instead, what I do find is that there's a much more evidence for a majority of millennials just leaving organized religion altogether, right? This finding, coupled with the very high rates of intergenerational retention of non-religion found here that I just showed you, are indicators that non-religion has become a default option of sorts amongst the millennial generation, that their social environments have become much more secular and post-Christian is a term we often use for that as well, compared with that of their parents and grandparents, right? The vast majority of individuals raised with no religion remain unaffiliated as young adults now, and many more coming from more religious backgrounds switch into non-religion. This is not just happening in Canada, right, where religiosity indicators have been long been weaker since the 1960s and declining, but it's also happening crucially in the US. I'm not going to go so far as saying like millennials are post-Christian full stop though, right? They're in that transition, but they're not like fully there yet because, there is still a large group of religious millennials amongst the generation, along with greater religious diversity overall amongst the generation. But, that being said, Christianity does still group together a pretty big portion of millennials, but a smaller portion than in prior generations, and seems to be on the decline, right? So I feel like the pendulum has kind of swung now, and that default option for many that people tend to fall back on amongst millennials is non-religion, and more so as we move amongst younger cohorts. This doesn't mean that religions could disappear altogether amongst millennials or even younger generations, but what it does mean is that there's now large groups on each side coexisting, right? There's large non-religious and large religious groups coexisting in the US as well as in Canada. And so, we can talk more about this if it's a direction you guys want to go into. What does that coexistence look like? How does that happen peacefully in some cases, not peacefully in others? What are some of the kind of political dynamics and tensions involved? So that was kind of the key things I want to touch on. Thanks for listening. And looking forward to the Q&A. Again, anything that interests you within this or any questions that you had that I might be able to answer, I'm happy to talk about it.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much, Sarah. I think a lot of us are quite into numbers and really enjoy seeing the
Okay,
support
good.
of the data that,
Not too many people asleep at this point. It's always a
yeah,
win.
well, we're kind of all geeks here, so what can I
Very
say?
good. You're my kind of
Many of
people.
us are, I should say. Um, okay, if you don't know how to raise your hand in Zoom, it's under reactions, and there's a place to raise your hand. So, because if you start waving your hand, I'm probably not going to see you because of the way the screen is set up. So please make sure you use the electronic hand. And David, you have a question. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, so it seems, and maybe I missed this in the presentation, but what is the actual causation mechanism that we're seeing? I mean, you said it's not really evidence for a free market of ideas, but is it that coming from a non-religious household, if a non-religious parent is the cause of this, or what is the actual cause? here, like, is a non-parent kind of like a dominant gene, and did that change over time? Because I think you're saying in past generations, people would actually convert to religion. So that was one question. The second question, real quick, was did you tease out any numbers for atheism versus non-religious, and if there's been gains in that change or that comparison of those two groups?
Yeah, no, great questions, David. Okay, so causal mechanisms. Causality in the social world is complex. And so there's usually more than one mechanism at play, right? So that's why, like, you know, it's not just like, oh, everyone went to university and everyone became non-religious. That's not necessarily what we find. So my kind of best way of saying it, I try and summarize it, is that we're not in the same society as we used to be, right? So we're not in a kind of more rural-based society of, say, like the 19th century, where the center of social, almost political and community life was like often the village church or a series of churches. And there wasn't a whole lot else to do, right? And there's a lot of social pressure to go. We're no longer in that context. And so as we've transitioned out of that context into kind of more, yes, urban areas, but that also have, you know, a lot of social services, activities, you know, service, consumer goods that are provided outside of religion, right? They're provided in many different areas, right? So like in public schools and the marketplace, right? By political parties, by a state that's not necessarily tied to a church anymore. We can talk about that, but in many places. And so as we've transitioned to that society where religion is one amongst many options, well, some people choose that option of religion still are into it. About, you know, 40% in the US of millennials, about a quarter of Canadians, millennials. But a lot of people don't, right? A lot of people don't choose that option anymore, choose other things and lead very fulfilling lives without it. And that process doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't usually happen over the course of one lifetime. It's usually a generational shift, right? I say usually a normal and trends, right? I'm always using these terms because you find a bit of everything amongst individuals. So you do have people who came from a very religious background who really disliked it and moved completely away and are strong atheists now. You also find people who are non-religious as kids who converted to a religion later on in life. But for the most part, you tend to see, you know, what you were raised in as a kid often influences how you act as an adult. Not always, but often. And so, you know, there's a series there of causal mechanisms, right? And so, yes, one of them now is that parents are much more successful in transmitting non-religion. And when I say that, they're not like actually trying to do it. They're not actively like, you know, okay, kid, you know, here's atheism, try and be atheist, right? Often parents, non-religious parents don't adopt that. They tend to kind of adopt, when we interview them, they often say, oh, I just take a hands-off approach, right? I don't really, you know, what the kid wants to do about religion, it's totally up to them. They can, you know, look around and decide what they want to do. It's kind of a very kind of anti-authoritarian, more personal choice-based approach to parenting. But often that does transmit a more kind of secular worldview where, you know, you kind of see all religions as sort of being out there, but not one necessarily being like the right one. And the parents aren't necessarily showing the child that it's necessarily important in their lives because they're not doing a whole lot about it in the household. And so often those individuals will remain non-religious. And especially in this context where everything around them is also non-religious, right? They're going to mostly secular public schools. Their friends are also non-religious for the most part. They're going to universities that are not faith-based for the most part. And so again, the social environment will also, you know, come into play versus say like in the 1940s, right? If someone was coming from non-religious parents, they would still then kind of go into a more religious context, usually in the world. They maybe see religion at school, their friends would be more religious. And so there'd be more like social pressures to kind of convert into that religion, even if they were coming from a non-religious background, which fewer were anyways. And so we see a lot better retention now of non-religion because the environment has changed, right? And so as a sociologist, those are the factors that I'm focused on, right? I'm aware that there's, you know, psychological factors, other factors involved, but those are the factors that I find especially important and are probably quite crucial, right? So religion is a social phenomenon. You find it in contexts that are more religious, but you also find time and places that are less religious. And it's often that kind of impact of the environment and how it affects the individual. So nowadays there's a lot less social pressure, especially amongst members of many groups in the millennial generation, to be religious. And you're seeing that in the numbers. Without that social pressure, a portion of them are not into it, right? And so yeah, you've got people leaving religion, and you've got non-religion keep going. That's transmitted amongst from parent to child at a much more successful rate than it used to be. Yeah. So that's how I'd explain it. So I know that's not like one cause and effect. It's not an easy answer, right? There's a lot going on, and it's a process that takes a long time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. Okay, and then your second question was atheism and non-religion. Yeah, great question. So yeah, I'm working with a larger non-religious category, right? Within that, some people will self-identify as atheists. I think it's about a quarter of that non-religious category that self-identifies as atheist or secular humanist. It's not every non-religious person that identifies that way. That label has strong connotations that not everyone's comfortable with, though I know you guys are a group that are. And so, especially, for example, in Canada, often the way that non-religious individuals will identify themselves, they won't be like, oh, I'm an atheist. They don't take like a strong identity in that sense. They kind of just say like, I don't really thought about it. I don't really have an identity. I'm kind of indifferent to it all. That's often what you'll find amongst many of them, and including a lot of millennials in the US too. Whereas, people coming from more religious environments, right, if they're quite strong about their non-religion, they'll take on that atheist or secular humanist label. You get some who do amongst millennials, but not everyone. And that atheist group tends to be, you kind of see the kind of trends being stronger amongst them, right? So it's interesting. You'll see some unique dynamics, but they are, for the most part, more left-leaning than the non-religious category overall, even more so. They'll also, be more actively engaged in organized groups, like in organizations and volunteering, than the kind of rest of the non-religion group that tends to be not a whole lot involved in groups. So we're slowly starting to study like specifically differences amongst just that kind of core of atheist identifiers, people who say they're atheists, versus the rest of the non-religious group who, share many characteristics with them. They don't necessarily believe in God, they're not all that religious, but don't have like a strong atheist identity that goes with that. And so we're kind of just beginning to look at those differences now. So I have a colleague, David Speed, in New Brunswick, who looks at that quite a bit in terms of like health outcomes and volunteering outcomes. And we find that actually atheists are, there's always a lot of research in the US. It's like, oh, religion leads to happiness, or religion leads to more volunteering. It's like, well, not necessarily, because that atheist group actually is very happy and is volunteering quite a bit, right? So yeah, there's diversity amongst the non-religious group as well. And that's one aspect of it. Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Did that answer?
Yeah. My question exactly.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, there's a lot going into that. I don't want to I'm just thinking about how do we attract people to be atheist, to identify as atheists, as opposed to being non-religious, as trying to bring them to crack a joke, be to the dark side eventually, so that's why I was asking that question there. So
a trend that we're starting to uncover that we find particularly fascinating, and there's some data showing this, but there's still more research to be done, is that your people who say they're atheists are actually coming from more religious environments, right? So like there's probably a higher rate of the non-religious in Florida who say they're atheists than the non-religious, say, in Ontario, right? Because they're dealing with a more kind of negative, difficult environment in terms of they're quite different from a lot of other people that are more religious in the social environment. They kind of take a stronger stance against that. It's like a kind of like almost like a shield. And they often are places where you find groups like yours, organized non-belief groups, who kind of get together because they don't just have non-religious people amongst their friends or family as much. So they want to like actually actively get together, defend their interests, right? Defend their political views, and kind of almost push back against a more religious environment. Whereas often what you find in like a place where non-religion is much more socially accepted is a kind of open indifference is often what we use amongst millennials. They're kind of like, oh, that's nice. You do you, I'll do me. What I do is not into religion, but are kind of not very involved, don't necessarily take a stronger non-religious identity, aren't necessarily involved all that much in organized groups about it. And so that's a trend we're starting to see emerge, which is interesting, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Megs, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
I think Jim and Bayless were before me.
Yeah, but they're going to be in the private room with her later, so I'm trying to give people.
Oh, okay. So I had two questions that I don't think I saw, but I'm struck by reading many autobiographies, especially people born 1700, 1800,
Okay.
who came from families of means. And they often, once they got to China, Japan, India, once they did foreign travel out of Western Europe or America, it was an accelerating decline. Many of them, Carl Rogers went off to study Chinese to be a missionary, and he came back pretty much an agnostic. And the same thing, and the other question observation, I've seen a couple of charts on the internet from reputable outfits showing the growth, a curve trajectory, long-term 20-year growth of the internet and the growth of the nuns. And the curve is almost identical. So your thoughts on foreign travel for greater breadth of whatever, and the internet.
Yeah, great questions. Another great set of questions. Okay, so yes, now there's, again, what I'm saying, there's probably still a lot of research to be done on this, so don't take what I say as the end all. I'm sure you won't. Again, those in the past who were able to come out as non-religious often were in a kind of stronger socioeconomic position, right? So again, like I mentioned, the male white university educated was a main group for this. Again, there were obviously people outside of that who were non-religious as well, but for the most part, that's where that non-religious group initially was coming from in the past, when there was more normative pressures surrounding them towards religion. Now, that group was able to be non-religious because they had social supports, they had other opportunities, they were in a kind of more secure social position that it didn't matter as much if they came out as non-religious. I'm sure they still faced, a lot of social pressure and a lot of social ostracism for it, but they could handle it because they were in like a more safe, secure, economically secure position. And those were often those people who traveled, right? So when they traveled, they were then exposed to environments that were different, right? So especially in China, for example, religion and spirituality looks very different in China. And for those who, maybe are not as involved in the culture or just traveling there for a bit, like it can seem very non-religious as compared to what we're used to in terms of organized religion in the States. The whole debate about, is China non-religious? Is it, there's obviously like the secularism of the Communist Party, but, they don't necessarily have like a weekly practice tied to their religion. They might just go to temple every so often and offer, gifts to their ancestors or worship their ancestors, but they don't really do it in the same way as we do in the West, right? And so if you went into an environment where you seeing different religions and be exposed to different stuff, I'd say like that group that was affluent was primed for that, right? It was primed to kind of move away from religion and could do that when they came back. They could hold that position and not face as many penalties as, say, like the poor Black woman who really, the religious group was her only support network, was her only source of social capital for the most part, was living probably a much harder life at the time. And so wasn't able to leave that as easily, right? And didn't have access to travel. So yeah, there's probably like a whole bunch of factors. That might be one of them. The other one is often what we find when we interview non-religious people is that exposure to religious diversity, to pluralism, actually can often lead to non-religion, because people are like, oh, hey, like, these beliefs that I was told were like the right religious beliefs. Oh, actually, they're not, right? Look at all these groups. Well, if there's so many groups, then maybe there's not one that's right. So I'm kind of just going to like hands off, not get into it. And that's actually a narrative that we find a lot. So it's possible that, as well as being primed socioeconomically for it, when they traveled, they were exposed to different worldviews that maybe put their own more Christian background into, focus or relative focus, and might allow them to think of other things, right? And maybe that was non-religion, right? Maybe that led to non-religion. But yeah, there's individual biographical pathways into non-religion that you do see some variation. I'm kind of talking about general trends, things that kind of come out a lot when we interview more than one person, right? Okay, the internet, let's talk. Okay, David asked a question earlier on about causal mechanisms. So let's talk about spurious correlation, or correlation with or without causation, right? Because you're right. As the internet arrived in the States, it's the same time that religion started to decline, right? We're talking about the 90s, the early 90s, the early to mid 1990s. That's really like you see arrival of internet starts taking off in private households and religion starts declining. That doesn't necessarily mean it's causal, right? Those are just two trends that happened at the same time. It could be, and there's a few mechanisms we could think of that it was in some ways. But the counterexample to that I like to use is, well, look at other countries. Other countries, religion started declining way earlier in Canada, in Britain, in France, in Germany. It started declining way earlier than the 1990s. It often, a lot of countries, we see that decline starting to happen around the 1960s. And some countries like France, it's even earlier. It's like at the start of the 20th century. In Britain as well, it starts earlier. Obviously there's all nuances in that. It's not everywhere. Some regions are distinct a bit within each country. There's certain groups that hold off for longer, but for the most part, US held out longer in terms of religion. And it's only since about the 1990s that we start to see a big drop in religiosity in the States. So there's a lot of debates about why that is. Why did the US go longer, right? Was it, the Cold War that tied atheism to communism and meant that there was like especially negative views of atheism? And so with the fall of the Soviet Union, did the kind of, did atheism kind of get a better rap after that? There was less kind of negative connotations associated with it. And then people started to become more comfortable being non-religious. Or was it a political thing, right? Was this kind of like shock and counter shock, right? The countercultural movement of the 1960s brought in a lot more liberal values for things like family, reproduction. And in many countries that kind of kept going, like in Canada, we never had like a backlash against that so much. But in the States, there was in the 70s and 80s, there was the Christian right, the religious right that kind of in opposition to these growing liberal values kind of came back with a more conservative approach and worldview and were in political power and managed to do quite well for a number of decades there. And was the 1990s like a counter, another swing in the other direction where like countering the Christian right, like people are like, whoa, if this is religion, if religion's like super conservative and like has all these weird conservative political views, I'm not into that, so I'm going to be non-religious, right? And or the internet comes along and exposes people to a lot of different worldviews, like we talked about before, allows them to form communities more easily between people like themselves who are non-religious, right? Like the digital atheism is a big part of those groups. All of that probably came into play. I'm not sure the internet was the single cause though, because again, like if it was, then we wouldn't have seen decline elsewhere, right? Like I think the US, what's peculiar about the US is I think you had that period of the 70s and 80s where you had the Christian right kind of come back in force, where we didn't see that necessarily in Canada and other European nations to the same extent. But again, lots of debate about that. There are a few scholars who really think it's the arrival of the internet that meant that religion declines. I'm not convinced because we don't see that elsewhere. We only see that in the US. So I don't think there's anything peculiar about the internet in the US that did it. I think it's tied to kind of larger political movements, but again, open for debate.
Thank you, Meg.
That answer? Any follow-up questions?
Meg,
Oh yeah.
muted.
So Belos is gonna ask him.
Yeah, no, I have no follow-up question. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just following up, Bayless had a follow-up question on that, was like, well, what is it about the US? Like, I argue that it's the socio-political specifics of the US, that lovely Christian right period that you had, that still seems to be going strong, right? That more polarized political context. I think when politics and religion are so intertwined, that can actually backfire and lead to people who are not into that form of politics will actually move away more to a greater extent from religion. Whereas in Canada, there's some of that. But in Canada, like religion isn't tied to politics all that much, right? Like we don't have a God's party where like we don't really talk about religion in our political sphere a whole lot. Maybe we should, but we don't. And so, you know, that there's not like that backlash. If you're like, you know, it's like, oh, wow, if like a religion is like super politically conservative, then I'm not that. I'm a more progressive person, so I must be non-religious in that case, right? I think that there's a stronger tie with politics and religion in the States. I think it kind of kept religion going longer, that kind of ties between American identity and Christianity. But once it started to decline, I think it's going to decline more quickly. And I think that's what you see with the arrival of a new generation in the 1990s, right? You see the arrival of the later Gen X cohort, the millennial cohort, who's not so much into that, right? Or who wants to move, at least some of them want to move away from that. But again, social reality is complex, right? So there's probably a number of things in the US that made the US last out longer, but it is now showing similar trends to most other European and nations in Canada, right? So once it started, it's looking pretty similar to other countries. It's just, it took later to start, basically, the decline of religion.
Bayless, did that answer your question? You're muted.
Pretty much, but I'm not still. Am I still muted? Can you hear me?
No,
We can hear you.
now.
Yeah.
What I was thinking was, especially with the United States, I mean, the biggest difference between us and our mother country or England was the fact that we had so much land. We've got bogs of land. They're on an island. They're complete. They've crowded all together in a place like London or something, you know. But here we can go out in the middle of nowhere and just be like I am now, be out in the middle of nowhere, and you can develop your own culture out in the middle of that, you know. And of course, we started with a lot of very highly religious groups that moved here to get away from England. And so I'm wondering if geography didn't have a bigger thing to play in here. I haven't seen much on that. I was wondering if you'd seen anything.
No, I haven't seen a whole lot. I have a colleague who's wondering if colder environments affects people's approach to these issues, to religious violence, actually, in the sense that, like, you know, in countries that are freezing cold, you don't care about if you're Catholic or Protestant. All you care about is like living through the winter, versus, you know, countries where that wasn't a survival issue as much, so they actually, you know, focus more on like Catholic Protestant differences. It's a historical perspective, which is a bit different. I digress. But the counterexample to that, Belos, is Canada, right? Because we also had a bunch of crazies come over from Europe over the last few centuries who were quite religious. We have a whole Mennonite community here nearby who's still quite has a whole traditional Mennonite lifestyle and communities that are still there. They're in their buggies and they're still not using technology. But that being said, we have a different outcome now, or further along the process now than the States, right? So again, like, yeah, it is a different context than Europe, where there is a lot more space here. There's a whole immigration history, right? Also of settler colonialism. But yeah, it's hard to unpack which factors came into play and come into play now, right? Yeah.
You're muted.
I like it. I find it complex. That's why I enjoy studying it, right? It's not an easy answer. If it was, I'd be out of a job, right?
Okay, thank you, Bayless. We're almost at 6:30. So, Jim, is your question quick?
A quick question, all right. Well, I hope you can hear me, but I found it to be most comforting and gratifying for hear your report concerning the sociological implications of the generational transition. And however, I'm also a little bit concerned about it, because as a philosopher, I find that there are fewer and fewer people interested in the kinds of issues that were often relegated to religious discussions or limited by religious discussions. But so I'm rather concerned that when it comes to ideas about history, economics, ethics, all the issues that we face as a people, and the need for a good analytical approach to those issues, that we're going to feel a certain kind of loss, because religion was a grand arena for the contest of at least some of these issues. And so I think we're going to need to find some sort of a substitute so that people can have a more mature and involved approach to the issues of their society. What do you think of this problem? Is it a problem?
No, it's interesting, yeah, because like we often study what's not there anymore, religion as much, but we don't study like what's replacing it or how like some of these functions that religion used to play, who's playing them now, like who is fulfilling that now in our societies, right? Listen, it's not my job as a sociologist to say if something is good or bad. I just kind of, that's always my approach to it. I just kind of want to understand how it works and to get a sense of what's changing, what's staying the same. And so, yeah, you're right. There's definitely religion no longer plays that role for many people. It does for some, but not as many amongst millennials. That kind of, like you say, these larger discussions about, you know, the kind of our understanding of where we are, our past, right? How we see ourselves. Now, I would argue that some other institutions have kind of taken up a bit of that. For example, the millennial generation has the largest proportion ever of people who went to university, who are going to university and college now, right? And these are topics not in every program, but in many arts programs and humanities programs that are also being discussed, but in a different way. That's not necessarily a religious kind of way, but a more, I don't know, like different philosophical approaches, critical thinking, historical views, different understandings of history. And so, you know, it's not like those discussions don't happen anymore. I'm sure they happen, you know, every generation has their own way of approaching these things. It's not something that I haven't looked into how widespread that is amongst millennials. I know there's always this worry that we're losing something with millennials, right? There's always like this worry amongst older generations that, you know, we're losing something important. And maybe we are, right? Like there's some things that we do lose in this transition. What do we lose and what replaces it, right? But I would say that it's not something I'm super worried about, because I guess I'm in a university context where these things get discussed all the time amongst young students. So in my social environment, it's a big part of the discussion and debates. But that being said, I'm from a specific environment. Not everyone goes to university, but a bigger chunk of millennials do. So maybe, you know, the higher education institutions play more of a role in that sense. That's like almost, it's not for everyone, but it is an important rite of passage for many members of the younger demographic. So we're talking about like half of the millennial generation goes through college or university, and it's like an important part of their late teens and early 20s. And there's parallels to kind of going through religious rites of passage or through the religious institution, like through, you know, in the old time, like marriage, confirmation, those sorts of things. And so, yeah, it's interesting. But it's not like I don't lose sleep over these things. It's not like I'm super worried. Like a generation has its new dynamics. It always does. And we just kind of understand them. And yes, some things are lost, and sometimes that's unfortunate, but sometimes, you know, things keep going or they get changed, and sometimes there's improvements in a generation. Sometimes things that get better for some people. Yeah, so it's hard for me to answer because I'm in an environment where I'm in a humanities faculty where I see lots of people discussing these things, but not necessarily within a religious group, right?
Much appreciate the objective information and the subjective.
Objective, yes. I'm not objective. I don't call myself that, but I do try and take a step back and look at it. Yeah, that's the ideal is objectiveness, even though the reality is always difficult to achieve. Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. Linda, I'm going to let you ask your question, but it's got to be very quick.
Yes. Like you talked about the religious backlash that happened in the US. Hi, I'm from Ontario, Mississauga.
Hey, Linda, how's it going?
I'm fine. My question is the backlash that happened in the 80s, you know, from, you know, the conservative backlash that happened in the States. Do you think it's happening in Canada now?
Well, so Canada's always hooked into what's happening in the States, right? Like I know the States doesn't pay much attention to us, and that's okay. There's nothing all that interesting that always happens here, but we're hooked into a lot of American media and stuff, right? So I know, for example, when we talk to people in Canada, their impression of evangelicals is very much influenced by what we see like sensationalized in the media coming from the States, or they think like, oh my God, it's like the people on Fox News, right? Whereas evangelicals in Canada are actually quite a bit different and are more progressive by far on a lot of issues. And so yeah, it's to a certain extent, there's a bit of that. We're always kind of influenced a bit by the US context. There's obviously certain dynamics that are peculiar to Canada, like there's, for example, the residential schools that have been a bigger part of the discussion recently, and all of the kind of Catholic churches' involvement, as well as some mainline Protestant denomination involvement in that. For those of you who don't know from the States, there's kind of a series of research groups that are uncovering unmarked graves in old residential school sites where Indigenous children were forced to attend over the course of the 19th century and the early 20th century, and were a big part of like the cultural genocide that happened to Indigenous peoples in Canada as well as in the States. And it's become a big part of our discussion because this is kind of like a difficult period of history that's being brought up again, that is part of kind of reconciling with Indigenous peoples in the country and trying to move forward. And so having a better view of the history that happened there, like a better understanding of what happened. And tied to that was, religious groups' roles in those residential schools that they ran for the most part before the state took over in the 20th century. And were run often on behalf of the crown or the state. And so there's that has caused some backlash, right? Some people are seeing that if that's what religion is, we don't want that, right? There's the sexual abuse scandals that still happen.
Yeah.
And there's also these issues of kind of religious diversity, and Bill 21 in Quebec hindering religious diversity. It's obviously the Canadian discussion's a bit different, but it is also to a certain extent impacted by the American discussion. But that being said, Linda, just to finish on this, the US, the religion is declining now. It's kind of, the US is catching up, right? Like it started later, the religious decline, but it's pretty much almost caught up to us. Not quite, but it's getting there. So their decline is rapid. So we're seeing a bit more of a clash in the States.
I just wonder if the religious decline is going to keep happening in Canada. That's all I wanted to know.
Yeah.
If we're gonna
Okay. Sorry. I kept going on. Yeah, pretty much. I'm expecting that our new census data is coming out soon at the end of this year. I'm expecting to see an increase. All the indicators point towards that, of an increase of non-religion. So I think we're still going, but it's a longer process in Canada. Like it started earlier and it's going more slowly than what you see in the States. It starts later, but it's declining more quickly. And I think that the fact that it started later and declining more quickly in the States is tied to the US socio-political context. Yeah. But again, still debated, right? So.
thank you.
Thank everybody for coming. I'm going to.
Can I just say, Judy, I tried to add the slides to the chat, but I failed. It's not letting me. So Judy, what I'll do is I'll email you the slides after this, and then maybe you can forward it to everyone if you have like a list or something.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do that after. Sorry about that, people. But
No
yeah,
problem.
you'll get the slides by email.
I'm going to open the room now. You will be moved automatically to the room with the membership.
All right.
So,
Well, thanks everyone for coming out.
Yes, thanks all of you for coming. You're welcome to stay in the public room and continue your discussion of anything you want. I'm going to stay here for a few minutes. If I miss someone that is a member that has not, didn't get moved to the room, please let me know. Otherwise, you're welcome to join AOF, and in the future when we have speakers, you'll get time alone with, or not alone, but the membership group gets time with the speakers. It's only $12 a year to, let me do this, be a member. So thank you all for coming, and we will see you next time. Our next scheduled meeting is May 1st with Ryan Cragen, who will be talking about how religion doesn't really make you happier. We may have a speaker in between because I'm still working on scheduling someone for April. But thank you all, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
If you are pleased with our programs, please tap the like button and then subscribe to our channel. Don't forget the bell so you don't miss any notices of new material. We usually post new content every week. See our created playlists to discover events thus far this year, or to see a list of topics and speakers from our rapidly growing and diverse collection since 1992.